They thought I would stay silent, that I would accept their arrogance as if my voice didn't matter. When the HOA's Queen Bee decided my lakeside cabin wasn't mine to keep and handed it over to her son, she didn't just steal a piece of property. She tried to erase me. What they didn't expect was that I'd turn their own rules against them, drawing a line so sharp it cut right through their power. By the time I was finished, my fence didn't just protect my home. It boxed them into their own downfall. The lake had always been my sanctuary. My grandfather bought the cabin decades ago, back when the land was considered worthless swamp. For my family, it wasn't just a building with creaking wood and peeling paint. It was history, survival, and proof that we could claim a piece of peace in a world that so often denied it to us. I spent summers learning to fish on those waters, winters splitting logs for the fireplace, and countless evenings watching the sun sink behind the trees while the air filled with the calls of loons. But the lake was changing. Over the years, wealthy families poured in, building oversized homes with shiny docks, pushing out the old-timers who had lived there for generations, and with them came the HOA. At first, they promised community improvements, better roads, security patrols, and property value protection. In reality, they created a kingdom where certain people were always at the bottom. It didn't take long before I noticed the pattern. Families like mine, those who didn't fit the mold of their carefully curated community, were singled out. We were told our fences were too high, our grass too long, our boats too small, our gatherings too loud. Every letter from the HOA carried the same message, unspoken yet clear: you don't belong here. Still, I stayed. The cabin wasn't just mine, it was my bloodline. Every plank and nail carried a story. I told myself I could endure the endless warnings and fees, that their stares and whispers couldn't break me. But what I didn't know was that the worst betrayal hadn't even arrived yet. And when it did, it came wearing pearls, sunglasses, and a smug smile that hid something far darker. It started subtly, the way most battles with the HOA did. First came the notices, claims that my cabin's dock extended too far into the water, that the paint on the siding didn't meet their aesthetic standards, that the gravel path leading to the porch was somehow a violation of community guidelines. I laughed at first, tossing the letters into a drawer. After all, the cabin had stood long before the HOA existed. How could they suddenly decide it no longer belonged? But the letters grew sharper. The fines increased. They started sending inspectors, clipboard in hand, who walked my property as though they owned it. Neighbors who once waved politely now looked the other way. At meetings, I overheard the whispers, subtle but heavy. That family doesn't fit in here. That cabin is dragging us all down. The final blow came one Friday afternoon when I returned from work to find an SUV parked in my driveway. Standing beside it was Karen, the self-appointed ruler of the HOA. Her pearl necklace gleamed in the sun, her sunglasses reflected the lake like she owned it, and beside her stood a man I'd never seen before. She smiled as if she had just done me a favor and announced that the cabin was no longer mine. According to her, the HOA had reallocated it to her son, citing unpaid fines and abandonment. I was stunned. Abandonment. I had been living there, paying utilities, maintaining the place with my own hands. Her son, a man in his 30s, with a smug grin and a polo shirt tucked too neatly into his shorts, strode across my porch like he already owned it. He carried himself with the entitlement of someone who had never heard the word no. The paperwork they waved in my face was a mess of fabricated charges and HOA bylaws twisted beyond recognition. They claimed I owed thousands in fees, that my cabin violated multiple codes, and that ownership had been transferred as a result. I felt the blood drain from my face. My grandfather's legacy, our family's safe haven, was being stolen in broad daylight, not with chains or guns, but with signatures and stamps. When I pushed back, Karen's mask slipped. She didn't bother with politeness. She told me people like me should be grateful to have lasted this long in such a community. She said her son would take better care of the property, that it would finally be in the right hands. The words dripped with poison, not just about property, but about who deserved to exist in that space and who did not. I could have folded right there, but something inside me hardened. If they wanted to play by the rules, then I would use their own rules against them. For weeks, I studied every bylaw, every clause, every loophole they had used to justify their theft. And with every page I read, I began sketching out a plan, not just to take back what was mine, but to show them that their power had limits. The day they tried to strip me of my cabin was the day I stopped being quiet. And soon, the fence I built would change everything. The first post went into the ground before dawn, the sound of the hammer echoing across the still lake. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, I had already marked the perimeter. Every swing of the mallet was fueled by anger. Every board, nailed into place, carried the weight of generations who had been told they didn't belong. This wasn't just a fence, it was a declaration. Within days, the barrier stretched high and unbroken, not only encircling my cabin, but extending outward, right through the narrow strip of land that led directly to the HOA's head office. What had once been their pristine pathway to power was now locked behind my fence, guarded by no trespassing signs so bold they could be read from the main road. I had done my research, and the land they prided themselves on walking across every day was technically mine. They had overlooked that in their rush to strip me of my rights. When Karen and her son arrived, they were furious. She shrieked, demanding the fence be torn down immediately, claiming it violated community standards. But I had the documents. I had the maps. I had the proof that the access road they used sat squarely within my deeded boundary. For years they had trampled it without consequence, but now the gate was locked, and the keys were mine. Neighbors gathered, whispers growing, into a roar as they realized the balance of power had shifted. Karen's son rattled the chain-link gate in rage, but it didn't matter. Their offices, their meetings, their carefully constructed empire, all of it was cut off. For the first time, they were the ones standing on the outside, powerless and seething. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I simply stood on my porch and watched as the empire that tried to erase me was boxed in by my fence. The humiliation on their faces was more powerful than any fine or letter they had ever sent me. In that moment, the cabin wasn't just defended. It was reclaimed. The fence changed everything. For the first time in years, the HOA couldn't touch me. Their letters piled up unanswered, their threats echoed hollow, and their meetings fell apart without access to the very space they once lorded over. I watched, from my porch, as their carefully constructed empire cracked, not with explosions or lawsuits, but with the simple weight of truth. They had no power where they had no claim. Word spread quickly around the lake. Families who had once whispered about me now stopped by with quiet nods of respect. Some admitted they too had been targeted, singled out for being different, for not fitting the picture the HOA wanted to paint. My fight became more than just about a cabin. It became about every person who had been told they didn't belong in a place they had every right to call home. Karen tried everything to undo what I had done. She filed complaints, threatened court battles, even staged a campaign to rally neighbors against me, but each attempt fell flat when the truth came out. The land she had ignored, the land she had dismissed as unimportant, was the very thing that gave me the upper hand. Her arrogance had blinded her, and now it was her downfall. Standing at the fence line one evening, I ran my hand over the rough wood and thought of my grandfather. He had built this cabin to last, never imagining it would become the center of such a storm. And yet, in defending it, I found more than just justice for my family. I found a voice for every person who had been silenced, mocked, or pushed aside because of who they were. In the end, the cabin remained ours, standing tall against the tide of greed and prejudice. The fence wasn't just protection, it was a reminder that no matter how many times they tried to erase us, we would build again, stronger and louder, until they could no longer ignore the truth. And maybe that's the real question we're left with. How many fences will it take before those who hide behind power finally learn they can't erase history or humanity?